And right now we welcome business correspondent Patrick Smalley in the Wellington studio. Kia ora and welcome, Patrick.
Kia ora.
Great to have you with us. Patrick is the editor and co-founder of Business Desk and has reported on the New Zealand economy and business since 1983. Now, really interested in your take on this Meridian Contact Energy proposal for a global-scale green hydrogen plant in Southland. And, of course, allied to that is the, 12-13% of electricity that the Tiwai Point smelter currently uses. Yeah. What is your take on their proposal?
Well, I think it's a potentially almost too clever attempt to wrap together a whole bunch of issues which are relevant to the electricity industry at the moment. The first is that we know that in 2024 the new contracts for electricity supply to the smelter that were signed last year, and which almost looked as if they wouldn't be signed and the smelter might close, this sort of endless game of chicken with the Tiwai Point smelter, runs through till 2024. So in 2024, exactly the same issue as keeps arising is going to arise again. So what's the biggest problem the electricity companies have when this arises is they have no negotiating power. Basically, it looks as if there's 12 or 13% of all of New Zealand's electricity suddenly is going to drop into the market.
Which would flood the market, so to speak, to a degree and put downwards pressure on price.
Oh, well, either that or it would see the closure of less economic plant. I mean, at the moment, you wouldn't actually be able to get all of that electricity up to the North Island where it would be consumed. So there would also need to be
get up to the grid,
be a whole lot of transmission grid upgrade costs as well. So they started looking, and I think the study is credible to this extent, is to say what would you do with that instead, that electricity instead, and what they are trying to create is the credible idea that there would be sufficient other demand for that electricity that Tiwai currently uses for them to have negotiating power when they come to the conversation and come back to the negotiating table probably in early 2024 with Rio.
So Meridian is the provider.
Largest provider.
The largest provider. Yep. Contact also has a role, does it?
Contact has a partial role. They're a smaller provider, and there are all kinds of swap arrangements in the background as well with other parts of the sector because it's such a big user.
It's a massive discount that Tiwai gets as a major customer, and we know it's also had its issues with its transmission costs, which is where it's focused quite often. But the bottom line is it gets a massive discount. However, as such a large customer, Meridian feels like it's on the back foot. Yeah,
well, I mean, Rio's always had the capacity because every time you talk about closing the smelter, immediately it's a huge political issue in Southland, and probably almost to the point where I think people in Southland are kind of probably sick of being played with a bit. But there's no getting around the fact that the smelter provides probably some of the most highly paid jobs at the very bottom of the South Island.
So in theory at least, Meridian and Contact are looking for an alternative industry that could tickle those boxes, that could provide jobs, become a significant part of the energy economy, and could use that power without having to hook up to the national grid.
That's right. And one of the reasons that they're keen on green hydrogen is that they know that the government is enamoured of green hydrogen as a concept. And the reason that we know that they may be prepared to make almost irrational policy decisions around that is that there was a blue hydrogen, which is a natural gas-based hydrogen proposal in the term of the last government, strongly supported by Shane Jones and therefore probably doomed to failure from day one, which would have used natural gas and carbon capture and storage technology to make hydrogen in Taranaki. That didn't go ahead partly because there was no enthusiasm for anything that used more natural gas. I mean, the government had just announced a ban on further exploration offshore for natural gas, so it didn't fit the narrative.
Can you explain what green hydrogen is? Because one of the issues with hydrogen is the production of it can end up being negative to the emissions profile, right?
Yes.
So what is green?
Green is where you're using renewable energy only to do the electrolysis process which is required to create hydrogen. Blue is using natural gas and carbon capture and storage, whereby you're using a fossil fuel but pumping the CO2 that comes out of that underground, a technology which is still really not entirely proven. Grey hydrogen is basically where you use coal or some other much more emitting type of fossil fuel to make it, and you don't worry about where the emissions go except into the atmosphere. So green has the appeal of being a truly carbon neutral product, but it's extremely expensive by comparison with the other two processes.
So pause before we carry on and assess whether we think this is viable and a genuine plan, or viable or not viable and actually a negotiating tactic. I want to just talk about the prospects of hydrogen briefly, because one of the energy suppliers at the moment, a smaller player, is offering a mix of 80% natural gas, 20% hydrogen, without having to swap out your gas appliances. Now, this is going to become an issue for people who want to retain gas appliances in the future, or certainly anyone who wants to add any more. Do we have a credible alternative to natural gas on its way, or is it still very much theoretical?
I think that we do. But the question is not whether it's hydrogen, but whether it's hydrogen or some other alternative, like electricity. Obviously you can't cook a barbecue on electricity, but you can do pretty much any other industrial or process heat through electricity, unless it's very, very hot.
So that's actually an important point. If you're going to go ahead and set up hydrogen plants, you need to know you've got a big enough customer base and can take a big enough share of the market to make it viable. So you look at cars on the one hand as a possibility, and a significant energy source of replacement for natural gas is the second, right? But you would have to have enough business ahead of you to risk this investment.
You have to have either enough business or confidence that it could be exported easily. And of course, the other source that we haven't talked about is biofuels, which is just as credible an alternative as electricity to hydrogen as a future fuel. So at the moment, there is no well-developed, efficient way to send green hydrogen offshore. So there's your first problem. The second problem is there's not currently a big hydrogen demand in New Zealand. That might emerge, but it's highly unlikely, I would have thought, that it will be emerging by 2024, 25. I think if there's any credibility in this proposal, it's more about putting it on the table and saying sometime in the next 10 years, maybe this will start to make sense. But my pick would be that there would have to be a lot of improvement in the ability to export it in some way, or you'll get a slightly different proposal. So this is not just a hydrogen process, it's also potentially an ammonia process. It could produce ammonia rather than hydrogen, but if I was an electricity company trying to win the public over with this, which of those two is going to sound better? Let's make a whole lot of ammonia so we can make fertiliser for New Zealand farms, which is full of climate change problems in itself, or should we go for green hydrogen, which we know ticks all the boxes with the government?
Rio Tinto itself, what's going to factor into its decision-making? Because we know, apart from the never-ending kind of brinkmanship, some would argue, it's also been trying to resolve its issues with the transmission costs with the government. But equally, it's had a period of flat prices. Global prices for aluminium, or actually they fell for a time. But is it going to be re-looking its long-term future as all these different changes happen? What will happen to the demand for aluminium in a carbon-reducing environment?
My pick would be that the demand for aluminium, which is produced with renewable electricity, green aluminium, will actually increase as time goes on. So they can argue they're
far more climate-friendly producers of aluminium than many other plants around the world.
Yes. The ones which are probably most comparable are in Canada, where there's also a lot of hydroelectricity
So it
used.
might be able to reposition its marketing as these changes roll out globally and say, hey, come to us.
Look at it this way. Yes, aluminium prices jump all over the place. At the moment, they're actually very strong. Rio Tinto is probably paying about $35 per megawatt hour for electricity at Rio Tinto at Tiwai Point. The break-even price at the moment would be $135 per megawatt hour. So there's a massive potential there for them to remain in business in New Zealand, doing what they're doing now. And then you put on top of the fact that they could market it as green. But there's another element to this as well. Rio Tinto and Alcoa have been doing, two of the biggest aluminium producers in the world, have been doing almost exactly what Meridian and Contact have been doing here, which is teaming up together to look for a new process for making aluminium. And they've got this thing called ELYSIS, ELYSIS, which replaces carbon anodes with an electrolysis process. Now, I don't find it impossible to imagine that you could see Rio Tinto decide to actually completely retool the Tiwai Point aluminium smelter to make green aluminium and blow this hydrogen idea out of the water.
So strategic move, at least, from Meridian and Contact.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Oh, you've also mentioned Lake Onslow, of course, and this is another factor. I spoke to the chief executive of Genesis Energy, who just utterly dismissed the concept. You might argue, well, he would, wouldn't he? because it would theoretically provide backup supply. And this is the issue. There's no incentive for the electricity companies to have surplus electricity sitting around. That is downward pressure on price. So when the dry years hit, they get their high spot prices. If we had a functioning backup system, that would obviously have an impact on their profit margins, frankly, particularly in dry years. So, yes, they might say that, mightn't they? And is this also a reason why these companies are moving to have this alternative, to try and...
Well, one of the problems with the aluminium smelter as it currently exists is that it's extremely expensive to ramp its production up and down. Basically, you have to turn off pots full of aluminium. It's molten aluminium. It cools. It sits in the pot. You've got to jimmy it out with a jackhammer, basically. Whereas with a hydrogen plant, you could ramp up and down its production depending on how the dry year was looking. I mean, that is an advantage. I don't know.
Maybe a touch too cynical.
Well, I mean, they certainly propose that as one of the ways that they could meet the need for more flexibility during a dry year. I mean, all Lake Onslow amounts to is a kind of a battery. It's a battery which the government owns as opposed to one of the power companies. So it's a lake where the government doesn't like the look of things and can pull the lever and change the whole wholesale electricity market dynamic.
It could do that in a regulatory way, though. If it wanted to get heavier-handed, it could do that in a regulatory way when we started getting into dry years. And it could contractually require that, potentially, couldn't it, of the electricity provider and of the smelter?
Yep. And in fact, the smelter contracts at the moment have such clauses in them, and because everybody in the electricity sector and the smelter itself are they're nervous as kittens at all times about the political risks that they face of stuffing up the environment around the electricity sector and pricing, that all are prepared generally to hold hands and try to make it work without having to be told to.
Well, that's another story at the moment, because just to finish this piece, do you sense a growing appetite in a government that's already undertaking multiple very complex reforms to move on electricity, remembering again it has got a majority, and anything big and sweeping it's going to do, it needs to do while it has that majority? Do you sense they are thinking again about, I don't know, reform towards a single buyer?
Okay, I'll go out on a limb here and say I don't think so. They did an electricity price review in the first term of this government, which reached a variety of conclusions, which meant that they did very little. It's an incredibly difficult area to get right and a very easy area to get wrong. I know that the high electricity spot prices are having massive impacts on industrial users.
New Zealand Steel starting to float, in some of that OIA released last week, starting to float the idea, hey, we've got options about where we run this plant.
True, but New Zealand Steel has also almost got a closed market in New Zealand for steel, which is 3 times as expensive as it was a year ago. Or those exact numbers may not be quite right, but the price of steel has gone up considerably. The only thing that's keeping New Zealand Steel, of course, profitable at the moment, though, is that price increase.
Okay, so again, and you've also got to ask how much reform of extremely complex and high-risk nature, as any reform is, are you prepared to undertake in one term?
I think they would be wary, because it's a difficult thing to start playing with. Don't forget, this may be too cynical, that the government owns 51% of 3 of the large electricity companies. They pay very substantial dividends. If we get a wet year, prices will fall again. The issue is more whether there are tweaks around the margin. I just don't think there's the appetite to go jumping into that area.
Now, the saliva testing saga. Speaking to Mary Louise McLaws, who should be listened to, because we spoke to her in the very early stages of the Sydney outbreak, just when the Australian visitor first came here, and she had been advising that state government to lock down, I think, when there was something, when the limousine driver had infected 6 people. Very knowledgeable epidemiologist, and was saying to us outright, you should be saliva testing before getting onto flights, bubble or no bubble, and you should be saliva testing when you land. We've had questions at the border. Why aren't we regularly saliva testing border workers as well as the nasal test? And I think even the minister said, I approved this stuff back in May. What's been going on with the slow and underutilised test?
And also, how much of a risk are we placing the country under by not using good saliva testing that we know exists, given that our only protections at the border are nasopharyngeal testing and good behaviour, basically. I mean, you really have to go back to last September when the Roche-Simpson report came out and said saliva testing should be added as soon as practically possible to the arsenal of tools that we have. Now, some of what I'm going to say is my supposition based on months of looking at this thing and a lot of access to internal documentation which hasn't really been able to be used in the public. My take on it is that the Ministry of Health didn't believe that saliva testing could be as good as nasopharyngeal testing, did everything that they could to slow the process down of introducing saliva testing, got a rocket from the government in about February to saying, where the heck is it? And at the same time found that they were... They had choices. They had this new startup company called Rako Science using a University of Illinois-based test, a new kind of saliva test which was highly accurate, which Rako had set up in New Zealand almost without anybody really noticing. And I think from the ministry's perspective, partly because of the individuals and the personalities involved, what was a startup was also an upstart. So Rako became a thorn in their side quite quickly by saying, we've got a good saliva test, we should be rolling this thing out. And the ministry's tendency until very, very recently was to say only nasopharyngeal testing can be trusted. But anyway...
But you can do both. This was Mary Louise McClaw's point. I don't know if you've got the figures there, but she said it's something like 80% reliable. 80% is better than not testing at all, and you can still do narrow pharyngeal tests periodically.
Well, the point is that the Rako and some other saliva tests are better than nasopharyngeal. So this is the thing that's extraordinary to me, is that in the last few days the Ministry of Health and Rako Science have quietly published, probably Rako just being polite to not embarrass people too much, a joint statement signed by both the Ministry and Rako's independent scientific advisor Janet Pittman, saying that their test is as accurate as nasopharyngeal swab tests with 98% agreement, 96.6% sensitivity and 98.6% specificity. This test has been available in New Zealand since last December. Now, the government, or the ministry's view, I think probably was that Rako was too new, too unknown and too small to really trust. What they wanted to do was work with Asia Pacific Healthcare Group, who have the saliva testing contract which the government has let. The trouble with the APHG test is that it hasn't got the same level of diagnostic validation as Rako and other tests which are out there, which are as good as nasopharyngeal. To some extent, this is pretty scandalous that there's been a desire to work with known partners. I accept that. APHG is a very good diagnostic laboratory chain running all throughout New Zealand, has done most of the nasopharyngeal testing, or a very large proportion of it, since the pandemic began. I can understand why you would want to work with them, but the reality is that the test that they're using is not diagnostically validated, does not use real-world samples, and is not as good or as understood or even as reliable a test, because we don't really know what it produces because it hasn't used real-world samples. And yet is now the frontline saliva test. So it's not just a matter of should we use saliva tests, it's also which saliva tests and why are we accepting this one.
So in December, when the Rako test became available, was the same data that the ministry is now accepting as credible and viable data available then?
Yes. It was. They were inclined to disbelieve it. And not only inclined to disbelieve it, but also to actively work against its being accepted across those private sector clients who wanted to use it, like the Auckland International Airport that started using it in February, and Air New Zealand, which was using it for a long period of time. Have
they been able to do subsequent, further peer-reviewed tests or further whatevers to bolster at all the information they had in December?
The Rako people?
No, either Rako or the ministry.
Well, part of the problem has been that ESR has been, it's the government crown agency which does has laboratories capable of doing this kind of work. They tried to replicate these tests and were unable to do so. And that appears to be more an issue with the quality of the work at ESR rather than the quality of the tests.
However, it does give reason for the Ministry of Health to pause.
Yeah. Yeah.
We keep hearing this. We've heard it around the Ian McRae at Orion going ballistic. I don't think he might be saying over what happened with the vaccine booking system, and saying we could have done this much more cheaply. We provided before. We had it also with the MIQ system, which queuing theorists and anyone working in the tech world could see could be radically improved with a design, first of all, on paper, and then the introduction of actually some fairly straightforward coding. But there has been this inclination to stay with the existing providers. One can respect the fact the ministry's under enormous pressure, it's got a lot of balls in the air, everything's happening. But when it comes to something like testing, a saliva test, that extra line of protection, and particularly now with this variant in play, it's just got to get more nimble, Patrick. It's just got to. Particularly
with Delta. I mean, I don't. I suppose we are starting to see now what the implications of Delta are. The fact that we closed the Trans-Tasman bubble is indicative of the extent to which we are as much, if not greater, risk of an outbreak in New Zealand as we have been at any time during this pandemic.
This was the plea of Mary-Louise McLaws again. Sorry to keep referring to her, the epidemiologist at New South Wales, University of New South Wales, and also an advisor of the World Health Organisation. This is what she said right back at the time this visitor came. You do not want this variant here.
No.
You should be saliva testing, bubble or no bubble, saliva testing before people get on flights and when they arrive. You do not want it here. What a coincidence now, though, with Delta's full impacts evident, that this agreement is reached.
Well, I'm not sure that the two may be linked time-wise. I think it's as much that the RACO guys made a massive nuisance of themselves, and eventually the Ministry of Health knew that it couldn't go, it had nowhere to go. Their own internal advisors were saying that the science is good. We can't keep saying the science is bad if the science is good.
See, that is not only a nimbleness problem, that is an attitude problem.
It's an institutional, attitudinal problem, yeah.
It's one with potentially big consequences when we need fast and world-leading and world-record time-breaking answers to a global pandemic like we got with the vaccine.
Yeah, I don't want to undermine
business as usual for everybody has got to change.
And it hasn't been business as usual for the Ministry of Health, I accept that. It's been an incredibly difficult time.
Yeah.
People in there must be exhausted and sick to death of getting questions from journalists like me. But the fact remains that you can't help but conclude that the Ministry's tendency is to want to go with the status quo, with the people they understand, and that there is a real inability to work with any kind of innovative idea. That I think they were almost embarrassed by alternatives arriving, which were as good or better than the ones that they knew about, and I think they became committed also to the existing infrastructure, which was all around nasopharyngeal testing. Now, if you're working near the border or you're working on an aircraft, you will have had a nasopharyngeal test every week for months. And it's a horrible thing to have done over and over again when there's an alternative which would do the job just as well. It's mad.
And can be more frequent and can supplement at least, if not replace. Patrick, thank you very, very much. Patrick Smalley is a business correspondent. He is the editor and co-founder of Business Desk.